Hey, Lori. How
Oh,
are
hey,
you?
Alyssa, how are you?
Good. Good as good as can be right now. Rolling with the punches here. Um, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay. Same, rolling with the punches.
Good. Can you share a little bit with folks about who you are and like your background?
Sure. My name is Lori Goodrich. I'm an occupational therapist, and I've been an OT for almost 20 years, which feels unfathomable. Um, and my specialty is I primarily work with kids, some adolescents and adults, and my background is and specialty is working with people with sensory integration-based challenges. Um, and then developmental and feeding challenges is sort of another area of interest. But I think today, thinking about what we'll be talking about, certainly knowing that my background and expertise is primarily in sensory integration.
Yeah, right. Well, thanks for joining me to help folks. There's so much to think about in this season, and it is so dysregulating in so many ways. And I'm excited to be able to give folks some tools of like, what does it look like to support your kiddos through this from a sensory perspective? Um, most folks doing this at home aren't OTs. and
Right.
and we as adults are, I think, really dysregulated through this as well. So I'm jazzed. And we now have there's so many components to it of just like being outside the norm, and maybe not having access to tools and services that you had before. But also, I think another component here is the being teachers as parents and figuring out how to navigate that. And we as teachers know a lot of tips and tricks and things that we do to support kiddos to be ready to learn
Right.
or engage in the classroom that we haven't taught parents. So I'm jazzed to give some tools here.
Right. And I think what you said really speaks to me in terms of, I think, I've been on social media and in contact with friends that have kids in my own family. And I think the amount of sort of dysregulation in general is certainly present throughout the community. And I think there's some exciting stuff going on. People are sharing ideas and information. I know I've seen lots of things about scheduling and activities that have been on social media, and also a lot of input about like, wow, this is really hard and different, like stressful situation. Everybody's home. Parents are trying to work from home. There's a lot of things that are creating an overwhelming situation for parents and children alike. I realize there's a lot of activities out there, but the idea of like, why would you pick certain ones and what are the benefits felt like maybe hoping to frame that would be really helpful to understand how different activities might help your kids, but also you in terms of feeling more grounded and more regulated and not so overwhelmed in this particular situation that we're in. So I thought maybe we'd spend some time talking about that today. That sound okay?
I love it. I'm here for it.
Yeah, and I think it's good to think about my background is sensory integration, and usually I'm working with people that have a challenge in that area. But I think the principles we know from sensory integration theory are how all of our bodies function. We're all sensory beings, and they're all tools and strategies that we can be thinking about for ourselves. Not just if you have an identified sensory processing challenge. So think about this for every member of your family, for your kids, for you, for anyone else that you know. How do we actually help our bodies kind of down-regulate in a situation where we're probably in that sort of, stress response a lot of the time for a variety of reasons?
Yeah, in sensory, the Seed Village knows, I'm obsessed with, but because you can't talk about emotional regulation without talking about sensory regulation. But some things that have been helpful for me as not an OT in learning this, just before we dive in, if people are like, what does sensory mean? I think of it like hangry, where I get really grumpy or I'm not a super regulated human when I'm hungry, because there's dysregulation happening there. And I think sometimes when we think about dysregulation, it can feel like this. I had somebody reach out and use the word autism, and I was like, well, we all are regulating and processing information, and it's not limited to folks who have diagnoses. So can you just give a quick, maybe 2-sentence, 3-sentence overview of what you mean by sensory before we dive into this a little deeper for folks?
Sure. So sensory integration is something we all do every day, all the time. And what it means is you're taking in everyday sensory input in a graded, controlled way, in the way it's supposed to be taken in. So you might be filtering out, like right now, I heard my heat just turned on. My body automatically says, not important, don't pay attention to it. It helps you filter and respond and understand the qualities of sensory input. So your body takes in information, boopity boop, computes it and says, important, not important, what does it mean? And then you do something productive with that. So that could be adult saying, put on your jacket, and you're like, ooh, I understand what that means. I can do that task. It could be something like when you're riding on your bike and your bike is starting to tip, you understand my bike is starting to fall and my body says you need to be upright. So it's taking in everyday sensory information and using it for productive output. Usually our bodies are doing this automatically and easily all the time. So it's usually when it's not working that we're more keenly aware. And that could be for someone that does have a sensory processing challenge, that's in their way a lot of the time. I think for people like you and I, and probably a lot of people that are listening, that could be under stress. Your body can be overwhelmed more easily. It doesn't mean that you have like a sensory processing challenge, but you might be thinking about sensory tools that might actually help kind of regulate your body. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense. Thank you. That's really helpful. All right, so let's dive in. Can you break down some different?
Yeah, so I know. I thought, geez, there's so much stuff out there, and even as for me, I'm like, wow, this is really overwhelming. And parents are trying to do their own jobs and deal with kids all being home and all these kind of things. So I thought the idea of maybe thinking about sort of 3 basic categories of activities would be helpful. We'll talk about examples and then a little bit on implementation. So today is not going to be a primary focus on like, do these activities. My goal is to help frame the benefits of different types of activities. And I know you did some talks on like schedules and routines. We're not going to spend a ton of time talking about that, but this information could easily be generalized into what people are already using for routines. So we're going to talk about types of activities, why we have, how they benefit us, examples, and then how we might think of how to integrate. So I hope that feels good. I'm going to frame it around kids in terms of activities, but I would strongly encourage adults to be thinking about these things for themselves as well. This is not unique to your child that's really active. I think we're under a lot of stress right now too. So I think taking care of ourselves is important.
Yeah, I love the idea of like creating this framework for folks, because like you said, it's amazing. There are so many helpers. There are so many things being shared about different activities or things you could do with kiddos while they're home, etc. And it is, I think, overwhelming to know like, okay, but when do I do what and why?
Right.
Right. So yeah, I'm jazzed. Let's go.
Right. Yeah, I'm pretty excited. So, and this is like how my brain loves to work of like, let's categorize some information. So we're going to talk about 3 different activity categories, and I want to just get the activity categories out there and explain a little bit of what they are, and then we'll talk about some examples. So the first thing is sensory-rich activities. So sensory-rich activities are things that are enhanced sensory input. So we'll give some examples later. Sensory input has a really strong benefit for our bodies, that it helps release those sort of feel-good endorphins, and it can help decrease and clear out stress responses that we're all responding to right now. It also has a nice benefit. It can help kind of turn the brain on so that we do have access to higher level thinking. So examples I talk to with parents sometimes when they're learning about this is, the parent that has to run in the morning, and if they don't run and get that like rhythmical input, they don't function as well during the day. So that's a really good example for ourselves, to be thinking of how sensory input matters for higher level skills. The other category I think that's really important is sort of downtime activities. So this is when the part of your nervous system that sort of rest and digest kicks in, and it lets your body recover. So this is a really important thing to be thinking about as well. The third one is more about what we're sort of expected to do all the time, which is sort of the engage the brain activities. These are, it could be for a child, it could be learning, it could be social play and sibling interactions, it could be learning a new task. These are usually like the outcomes of what we're looking for. And how I think about this is sensory input can help kind of set the stage for success with those engage the brain activities. And then the downtime is sort of your recovery from, I was working really hard on this thing. So like for me, actually before I sat down today, I was like, I'm going to ground myself. I rode my indoor bike for a little while. And then I purposely scheduled my second meeting that I have today a little bit after my time with Alyssa, so that I have time to, read a book or do some meditation, so I can really ground myself before I get into the next sort of, activity that I need to do.
Yeah.
So those are sort of the 3 categories that I have in mind. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do have notes because I have examples of things. So sorry. I'm going to click on this.
Okay.
I'm dual computering, which is always super fun. So the next thing we're going to talk about. So do those concepts make sense to you, Alyssa? Those sort of 3 categories?
They do. I actually this morning in my like parent support groups that I'm running right now for folks who wanted like daily support, I had someone who said she was like, we had the best day we've had long time yesterday. I was like, awesome. She was like, I realized at 3:00 we had this like meltdown. He crashed. And when I started to put it together, like we had been doing activities, and she's like, I think if I would have come in like 10 minutes earlier and like had a pause and a rest time, he would have been okay. But we got to the point of him crashing. Right. And so like, as you were just describing this, I was like, yeah, like thinking of her and this idea of like, yeah, we can only go for so long before we need that downtime or rest. And having these like in our brain as we are thinking about those schedules and when to schedule what and when or how, like in order to have like optimal function during this time makes total sense.
Right. And I think that's such a good example. That mom or parent being like, oh, I noticed this, like playing detective and being like, how long can my child go? How long can I go without having a break? I think we can pretty much expect we're going to need more It's sort of tricky, right? Because you're like, for the most part, you're kind of stuck in the house or near your house. So less access to all your usual things. And you kind of are under more stress. So the idea of how do we kind of up the ante from a sensory perspective and those kind of things. So it's kind of a big ask, but I think if we start playing detective, one is I think being very patient with yourself and having grace with the fact that not going to be easy, but like that mom's example is such a good one of she's actively thinking, I noticed this, and then she's going to learn what are the cues or how long, or what are the cues that we're kind of at that overwhelm stage. Because the advice I always give families, and this is true for all of us, is trying to calm somebody down once they've like, fallen off the cliff and are overwhelmed is way harder. Yeah. So, and that's true for like, it's sort of like if I'm upset, don't try to rationalize with me, right? So I think those are good things for us to think about in terms of like how often, and it's different for everybody that you're going to need these kind of opportunities for sensory input and downtime to access all the other sort of demands of the day.
Yeah. And I love that you brought it up that like it is easier. Our goal here with all of our work at Seed is to be able to provide you with tools to be able to process emotions. And we're looking at like, rather than having like huge blowouts throughout the day, how are we helping kids feel more regulated so that they aren't having these giant blowouts and can still experience and express an emotion? Totally. And actually just in one of my coaching clients yesterday, we were talking about this and responding in the moment. We were focused on responding in the moment and how to do that. And I was like, yeah, and I'd like you to start tracking like, when are you seeing these big expressions so that we can see like, is it near lunchtime? Could we pull lunch a little earlier? Is it, so has it been a while since you've had any physical contact? Could you use like a snuggle in reading a book before we go into that next activity? Right. A huge part of this for us as teachers that I think we can bring to now parents is that reflective practice piece. Like I've never left a day as a teacher and been like, today was so perfect and there was nothing wrong with today. Right. And it's always looking back and being like, okay, where did the wheels come off the bus? Was there anything that was potentially triggered there that we could adjust going forward?
Right. Actually, I was thinking as you were talking, one of the best things about people using all these visual schedules is that the adults don't have to remember necessarily as much, right? You're like, oh, we did one movement break and one downtime thing today and everybody was losing it, including me, right? Okay, that wasn't enough. I might have to up the ante and change the schedule. The other thing that I think, and we'll talk about some examples, is these are all so unique from person to person in terms of like exactly what works for them. So in terms of like my threshold versus your threshold for input, we'll talk about all these things, but it's different for everybody, which it makes it a little bit trickier, but hopefully some key concepts will help kind of set the stage for feeling like people can walk away with some tools and some thoughts on how to kind of think about all these things that they're being bombarded with, this social media platform and this list of things. And I looked at this website, this idea of like, people don't need more activity ideas from me. I feel like what they need is a framework of what they're trying to pick and choose from.
Yeah, and the schedule to lay it out with that like is unique to them. You'll maybe have noticed we in Seed have never once put out a schedule like here's the schedule you should follow for your kiddo because it is individualized. And even within a classroom of like 9 toddlers, we had 9 individual schedules really, and it would be like tweaking a little bit here and there. Like this kid needs input 15 minutes earlier than this kid, and like structuring. But we instead are like, here are things you can use to create the visual schedule that works for your family unit. But being mindful of the fact that like the schedule you find online that is like at 9 o'clock do this and at 10 do this isn't necessarily going to work for your family unit, and that's okay.
Yeah, one of the people I always think about is Emily, who I know you've also done some work with, who's a speech therapist. She and I know each other, and our sensory threshold in terms of what we need is like totally different. Mine's on the low side. Hers is on the like very high side. So like, we went for a walk the other day and she'd already been out like running and that stuff. And I was like, oh, this was my physical activity for the day and it's not yours. So it is really individual. And I think trying to pay attention to all those things is tricky, but hopefully this sets the stage for thinking about it.
Yeah, cool. Let's go.
All right. So sorry. I feel like I have my like list of things that I'm like, I want to make sure I'm sharing all the right stuff. So bear with my low tech skills of having 2 computers.
Oh, you're fine.
So we think about, we're going to talk about kind of some ideas around about these different categories and different activities. These are going to be beginning ideas to give you the idea of what I'm talking about by sensory rich activities.
Cool.
And then we'll talk about sort of what to do with this information. So you don't have to like seriously write them down unless one sounds like, oh yeah, my kid will definitely love that.
Okay.
All right. So we think of sensory rich activities. The 3 main sensory inputs that we're talking about are touch, movement, and muscle activation. So those are like the 3 cores of like how our bodies function. All the other senses are important, but those are like the 3 main ones. So if we think about activities that would be enhanced muscle and movement opportunities, doing games that are pushing games are really helpful to get muscles going. So one of my favorite ones, and you can do variations off this, is, push a box or a laundry basket around and go around the house and like collect things. That's a really great activity. That's easy to do. You don't have to go out and buy anything. You can do it around your own house. I have some older clients that used to like to do races doing things like this where, 2 people are going to be pushing boxes and we're going to time each other. So there's ways of doing it with like, if you have more than one child. Another great thing to do is if you have pillows, so pillows around the house or off the couch, making a pile of pillows is great. The kids can jump in, and do those kind of activities. You can also use that for more touch input. So like a treasure hunt, digging through pillows. So that pile could be used for various things.
Yeah.
One of my nephew's favorite things to do at home when he's sort of stuck inside, which, when he's 7 now, so he's not as into this, he would take his gymnastics mat and lay it over the couch and we would shove all the pillows under it to turn it into a slide.
Oh, fun.
And climb up and down and up and down and up and down and roll it up and down. So those are like easy, if you have a soft gymnastics mat and pillows in your house, that's a nice way of getting some input in.
Yeah. Or even like a crib mattress or a toddler like mattress or something.
Oh, totally. Yeah. You could definitely use anything that's that sort of like firmish foam.
Yeah.
A mattress is a great idea. Hippity hops, which are like a thing of the 80s and the 90s, but some families still have them. For those inflatable balls that you hold on to the handles and jump around the house.
Would a roadie be like the same sort of input?
Roadie is a perfect example for a younger child. Yeah. So like if you had an older child, the roadie is probably not going to be as exciting for them. Right. But they might, if they're, it could be that they do get into that and it's sort of a pretend game of we're galloping off to, different places.
Yeah, I immediately like roadie comes on and then I hear that Trot Old Joe song in my head that we sang on repeat 8 billion times a day in my childhood.
Yeah, and then if you're thinking of a really younger kid, right, the idea of like they can't necessarily do that themselves, but you can do some bouncing on your lap or sitting on a yoga ball and bouncing, which also gives you input, which is fantastic. Those are some things that I'm thinking about. Other things, if you're game and don't have stairs that make it a safety hazard, riding toys inside, like a plasma car and those kind of things are great. You can also make your own riding toys, which would be, child sits on a blanket and you're pulling them. Woof. Or they can take turns pulling each other.
The workout.
I know, right? You're going to be like buff grown-ups. Also for younger kids, things like being wrapped in a blanket. So just like using your discretion on how big your child is. I know a lot of kids like doing the flip game, right? The kids wrap their legs around, you're holding them upright and then they drop and then they flip over.
Yeah.
Like that's a great way of getting muscle and movement in.
Cool. Or those are some, you like hold their hands and they climb up your body and flip.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Like all different versions of that. Upside down is always good. And that's a really good muscle activity too.
Cool.
Yeah. So those are some of the things that I'm thinking. I hope that gives the idea of like that's enhanced muscle and or movement as a way of getting, it's more than just walking around the house.
Right.
Those kind of things. Anything that you can do with heavier objects is also good, like carrying delivery games. If you have empty jug bottles and those kind of things, you can fill them with water and, you're delivering them somewhere. Laundry baskets was like a favorite of mine when I was a kid. So I like put things in a laundry basket and push it around. So those are some beginning ideas. So when you're out there and you're like, people have different tools and resources on the web, the idea of like, this is what you're looking for when you're thinking of like increased muscle and movement activity.
Yeah. Cool. I also had a flashback to my infant room of my kiddos coming and doing down dog into my lap, and then we would flip their legs up. And some of them, like one of the first like words or phrases they ever had was upside down baby, because we upside down baby.
I love that.
It was so good.
That's so cute.
Like picture them doing it.
Totally. That's adorable.
So sweet.
Yeah.
When we're looking at these activities, how would you know, or what might you be looking for to know like, ooh, my kid might be craving some of this input?
That's a really good question. It's different for everybody. I would say you're not trying to like force kids to do anything. So like if you want to do that upside down thing and the kid was like, no, I think using them as a gauge of what their preferences are is a good idea. If your question is like, how do I know if it's working? Is that kind of the question?
Well, kind of like, if I'm in that reflective practice stage of like looking back, where did the wheels come off the bus? And I'm trying to see like, oh, could they use more of this input or movement at certain times of the day? What might I be looking for to know, maybe they could use more at this point, or maybe is there such thing as too much? Like,
So I think the way that you're going to know if it works is, how we talked about, you do sensory input and then you kind of see those like engage the brain kind of activities, or just general demand of the day, maybe flexibility with siblings, more focus, maybe more patient with things. Sort of like what outcomes are you hoping to change? Again, that's different for everybody. So it's hard to be like, it's definitely these three things.
Right.
But I think the outcomes of what you're looking at, like, can they focus more? Are they more independent with play? Those kind of things. If you're seeing that, it means you're doing the right kind of input and that probably reached their threshold. If you don't see a change, it might be they need more of it, or it's a different, more of that activity, or maybe a combination of activities. This is hard to give advice because everyone's different, and actually our sensory preference changes day to day. So it's not unless you're like, you wouldn't usually be dizzy on one day and not another, but that's possible. You can overwhelm kids with things like spinning. So unless your child has a very high threshold for fast rotation, you can actually overwhelm their system. So just, I feel like most parents are aware of that from their kids being on playground equipment, but it's a good thing to keep in mind.
Right. So it's really looking and seeing like, did it seem to be regulating for them?
Right.
And one thing that I, just in my experience as a teacher, my kiddos needed more of this input than I realized, like more frequently, I guess, right? I'd be like, okay, we went and did an activity in the morning and in the afternoon.
Right.
And then started to realize there were some kids who really needed some sort of input, like every 2 hours, even if it was 5 minutes. But it was more frequent than I had realized.
Right. So sensory input stays in your system for about 1.5 to 2 hours for the most part.
There it is.
So there you go. That makes sense. So this is something, there are people, I'm sure, that doing one cycle of this would be enough. But I would say, if you think of it like meals, like breakfast, lunch, and dinner, the idea of like having sensory input probably at least a couple times a day is a really smart idea.
Okay.
I think if you're thinking of, I know some kids are doing school things and, you're trying to be like, how do we keep with academics? depending on your child's age. I mean, you could do things like if they're working on sorting or counting, you could add them into some of these activities. But what we don't want to do is, it's totally okay to add a small cognitive task. You don't want it to be so much that they're not reaping the benefits. I always think of like learning to drive my car. You're like, okay, my hands are fixed, and I like all I can do is this one thing.
Yeah.
I can't take in all these other things. So if you increase the demands in other ways, it might be an overwhelming situation. I don't know if that car example actually made sense. Never mind.
No, it makes total sense to me that like you could just, sometimes are focused in on like, I'm learning one new thing and it's too much to take in more.
Right.
That makes total sense. Is it generally more helpful or regulating to do an activity like this before you would say you have to do academic stuff for school or whatever? Would you want to do it before or after? What's that usually look like?
I would say, I think the like general, like if I'm thinking about like a typical cycle for somebody, and I was thinking about what would I even do for myself would be, I would do sensory input. Then it's whatever the sort of engage the brain activity or sort of task demand that exists, right? Schoolwork or anything like that. Mm-hmm. And then doing downtime after that. Downtime could also involve sensory input. It doesn't have to be like, do this quiet activity. But that sort of cycle of like, you're kind of ramping the body up to do its best, to do its absolute best with the skill, and then it's helping recover after that skill.
Okay.
We all do this pretty naturally if you pay attention to your actual like day cycle of how we function as adults, and you know when you're not doing it because you're like, why am I stressed out and overwhelmed? Because you're in that like high, expecting yourself to function at this high state all the time, and most of us don't. You know, you go for a walk at lunch, you like, even go take a water break, those like small things we do to kind of recuperate during the day.
Yeah, the other day I had been like knee deep in work for a while and was getting to the point where I like couldn't continue to do work, but still like powered through. That is an area of growth for Alyssa, not powering. But I did, and then Zach came down and he was done with work and he tried to talk to me about dinner. And I just snapped. I was like, I can't talk about dinner right now. And then I was like, ooh, I'm going to go for a walk. And I did. And I just like set stuff down. It's so hard for me to walk away from. And I set stuff down and I put shoes on and I walked and outside and came back and was like, and I'm sorry. Like now I can recognize and I'm regulated enough to talk about dinner or do something else. But I hadn't potentially had I taken a break before he asked me about dinner and taken care of myself a little bit, I wouldn't have snapped about dinner.
Right. That's such a good example, right, of how we experience it as adults. Yeah.
It's hard to be proactive about, right? Like
it is.
Preventing the snapping versus like the rupture and repair is like, I'm cozier or more accustomed to rupture and repair. We'll yell at each other. I'll take a walk and then I'll come back and repair versus Alyssa, let's see how you could prevent yourself from yelling about Zach very kindly asking what you want him to make for dinner.
Right. I talk to I do this, or I'm actively working on it. And I've talked to a couple friends and coworkers or colleagues about this also, like, what's my script when I'm stressed and I can't engage? Like, can I come find you in 5 minutes? Like, like what's my little thing that I say that's like, I need space right now, but I want to engage with you. But it's like, you almost need like a little script is the only word I can think of.
Totally,
it's like, or phrase. What do I say when I'm like, I'm not ready for this?
Right.
I know one thing I've been doing is when people have been messaging me about things, I'm like, can we schedule a time for that? Because at some point you're like, you're trying to deal with your own stuff and other people, and you want to be like open and supportive, but also not at the cost of like your own self.
Yeah, I think that's probably really helpful for a lot of folks who are trying to work from home right now and do all these other things. And yeah, I think it's a helpful script to have. And we talk in parenthood so often about like self-care and taking care of yourself. But what I'm hearing like in this conversation here is that this self-care could be taking those little breaks or making sure that you have the sensory input that you need to show up as a more regulated human.
Right. I think I hear you, like you say, I feel like I've heard you say this. I know I say it, like, you got to put the mask on yourself before you can help somebody else in a plane. It absolutely applies to this. Mm-hmm. So I think we're going to talk about activities for kids, but you might think, be thinking about what your own are: yoga, breath. If you go for a short walk, these are things that you can be plugging things in. I also think what are activities I can do with my kid that we can both do and I can benefit? Like that racing game. I know my nephew, like I said, I'm like, those are fun games for adults and it helps us recover too.
Yeah. Right.
And set the stage for all of us being more patient, more able to do all the things we're being asked to do, not letting cortisol and adrenaline just pump through our systems all the time, which is like not,
right.
It's probably, I think we can assume is happening pretty regularly for all of us.
I think for the world right now.
Yeah. Just a big cortisol adrenaline pump.
It really is. It really is. Yeah, no, it's helpful to think about like what you could do with kiddos. So is it true for adults too, the like hour and a half to 2 hours of like, that's how long there's benefit to the system?
Yeah, the nervous system is pretty much the same for in general.
All right. Noted.
I think for us it's a little different as adults. Like I think like for me, we have higher level cognitive thinking as adults, right? So I don't have to get my body totally calm to feel like I can access skill in the same way that a child does, because I can use my cognitive skills to actually support. You're calm enough to do this, right? It's a little bit, because it's just a little bit different, but it's the same principles apply. Our nervous systems, grow and change a little bit, but for the most part, those statements are true for all.
Yeah. So like the morning run it's not going to carry you through the day. It might help you for a while, and then you're going to have to do some more things.
Right.
Okay.
Right. That might be like your, I love this idea of like a bank. So you're like making a deposit, and you're making withdrawals. So if you put a big deposit in like a run, that might last a little bit longer, or maybe only require less deposits during the day. Right. Versus if you were like, ooh, I woke up late and I only had time for like a mile instead of 5 miles, that deposit is smaller. So you're going to have to think of how do I make more deposits during the day in general.
As a gal who has not woken up and gone for a run in a lot of years with no plans to implement that anytime soon, I'm like, I got to be making some deposits all throughout the day.
Yeah. I bought a bike for my house around the beginning of the year, and I was like, well, this will work out well, like for like health, but also for sensory input.
Totally. All right. So let's talk about this rest part, because I
want to just talk about the tactile system briefly. Sorry. Yeah, that's okay. And then we'll get into the downtime stuff. Is that okay?
Okay. Yeah, perfect.
So the third system is your touch system. And different ways you can get input to this system are doing things like burrito or wrap. So like wrapping up your child in a blanket, really fun game to take turns doing. They wrap you, you wrap them, maybe they roll across you and add like ketchup and mustard. Doing sandwich games that, there's one couch cushion body and then another couch cushion and, squish, squish, squish. Doing things like, even if you're doing activities like reading together, like cuddling or being inside of a sleeping bag or having, a little bit of extra firm pressure is a great way of adding input in that way. The pillow pile search that I was talking about earlier is a great way of getting tactile input. And then if you have an exercise ball, which I feel like is kind of relatively commonplace, you could use any ball actually, but doing like a steamroller. So person either lies on their stomach or their back. You can also do both, and you're rolling over with pretty firm pressure over all the body parts. And some people do like having their heads done. You want to check in on that. But and I have clients that love doing this, having me do it to them, but they love giving that input to me. So this is where you start to get benefits for everybody. And then the person that's doing the rolling to the other person actually starts to get some of that muscle input. So as general principles for sensory input, everyone's preferences are a little bit different, but the main things that are really organizing are this sort of deep touch pressure that we're talking about. So like the steamroller, massage. A class that I went to years ago was like, if you're not sure what to do, do muscle work, because that works for everybody.
Cool.
So that's a really good principle. And rhythm is another good one. So we're talking about like if you're doing the steamroller or you're doing like giddy up on your lap or you're doing roadie, those are other ways of thinking about just common things that work for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's like the baby that loves to be bounced on the yoga ball.
Totally. Yeah. Totally. Yeah. And I think about like the moms that I know that use that when their kids were little, is that's like incredibly helpful for the child, but like it is grounding for our nervous systems as well. So I think the idea of how do you kill two birds with one stone, right? You're like helping my kid and helping me.
Right.
Okay. All right. Are you ready to dive into the downtime activities?
I am, because I think right now when you're trying to work from home, And like, there's a lot of like, what do I do to get my kid to have downtime because I've got to work from home, or I just need a break. Even if I'm not working from home, whenever I need a break.
Yeah. So I would love to share some ideas that I had. I bet you have ideas, and I'm sure people are listening, they're going to have even more ideas. So kind of depends on your preferences. Like things like audiobooks are great. Arts and craft kind of activities. I mean, for kids or adults, the idea is you don't want to make it too hard that they're having to get into that sort of really cognitive brain, but like coloring is a great one. Breath activities are really good. I know OTA and the Spiral Foundation, which are two organizations that I'm affiliated with, have been posting activities on there. So like different blowing games. I know one of my favorite ones is called Bubble Mountain, which is you can actually do in the bathtub, and you can also do it in the like a bucket of water. If your kids are sick, this is not the activity for you, because then they're going to be sharing like, spit. But you take a bucket of water. What we do in the clinic is we do a bucket of water with this detergent soap and then a straw, and then you blow and the thing just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So it's really motivating and fun. But breath can really help kind of regulate our bodies. What are some other things? I know like a lot of kids like have quiet spaces in their house, like a tent, or maybe they've made a fort. Like just hang out time in there, like bring your books, bring the music that you like, and be like, this is like chill out time.
Yeah.
And these are things parents might be, it's sort of like teaching concepts to kids of like, our bodies need to have a break. How are we going to do that?
Yeah. So for me, what I'm hearing is like kind of reduced stimulation. I think of in school, like when we were going towards this, we would make sure we didn't have background music on. Or if we did, it was like low and soft and calming, and we weren't like having a dance party right now. Or screens were off. We would dim lights. And it's so wild how much like dimming the lights can calm us.
Totally. And those are great ideas if you have a kid that's like, I don't want quiet time. Be like, okay, we're just going to change the environment a little bit just to help even decrease stimulation, right?
Yeah, totally. And a lot of the things you were mentioning are things that are on our list of coping strategies, which is really about just calming that central nervous system. So this makes total sense, like reading, coloring. And this is something like even for kids who like weren't napping anymore, but we want them to have a rest period. We might do like a little clipboard with paper and a crayon they can color with. And what are your thoughts on this being something where if you like a kid who's having maybe some solo play or calm play, but I imagine like my niece loves like the dollhouse and these little figurines and whatever, and she'd go and play by herself. It seems like calm, quiet play. Would that fall into this category?
I think that's a really good question. I think that to me is like, it's worth trying to see how it plays out. I feel like I spend a lot of time with children, and sometimes when they get in their imagination, it's not going to have the same benefit. So, but I do think the idea of like, if what you're trying to teach them is we're going to have quiet time, if that feels like what you have access to, I would try it and see how it works. And this whole idea of like, it's anything that we do is we're trying this, and like, we're not going to be like, don't do that activity. That's not a good idea. But it's like, did we get what we wanted out of it?
Right.
And what a parent might actually get out of that might not be the downtime, but it could be the child entertaining themselves. And that might be what the parent needs to be their best self. So I think there's a lot of flexibility. I would encourage parents to try things. Coming up, I know my sister is a teacher and is going to be teaching from home via Zoom next week, which she and I have already been talking about, like, what activities can her son do independently?
Yeah.
And how does he's old enough to write. So can he write down things he wants to tell mom when she's done, at least to like minimize interruption? Right. Probably not going to take it away. But that idea of how do we start to think of what are our quiet games that we can do? And this is a great life skill. Like I know your whole focus on coping mechanisms and strategies. Like this is a life skill that we all need. So maybe this is like a nice time to be practicing it and developing skills.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah. Is there something... we talk a lot about using visual aids to support kiddos through this. Mm-hmm. Is it something that like having a sand timer or the like timer with the red stuff? I don't know where it is. Is that something that would be beneficial in this time period of like, because we get a lot of kids who are like, is it done yet? Are you going to come play with me yet?
Right. I think those are all strategies you might think about, right? Like using a timer, and those kind of things. Downtime could also be with somebody else if it needed to be. If you're like, my kid is really fighting this, if we need to lay down together in the fort, like that's totally, those are all fine. It doesn't have to be by yourself. But I think you might already have strategies like timers work well for my kids. Or, sometimes even like, okay, you're going to look at 3 books and then downtime is going to be over. You can use different ways of structuring time for kids that don't understand the passing of it. So I think it's worth trying to see what strategy works, especially if your child's like, are we done? Are we done? Are we done? How do you give them a sense of what the expectation is and then grading that within what works for them?
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah. Kind of the non-answer, sorry.
No. It's just saying like, yeah, you can use these if it's helpful.
Yeah, totally.
I was on a work call with one of my employees the other day whose child she was using the red timer, the timer that has the red, I might find it.
It's called the time timer, isn't it?
I don't know the names of anything.
I think it's time timer, and they actually have an app.
Oh, they do?
Yes. FYI, everybody, you don't have to go buy these. I'm like 95% sure I saw this at conference last year. They have an app.
Cool. But she was using that, and the rule was when the red was gone, right, then mom was going to take a break from work and come play. And so it just gave her this idea of like, rather than like, are you done now? Are you done now? Are you done now? Are you coming to play now? There was a rule because she can't tell time. She couldn't tell her like at 11 o'clock, I'm going to come. She doesn't know what that means yet.
Right. So they're just going to keep asking. Yeah. The other thing our therapists that I work with use, I don't have any clients that have needed this, so I'm not I don't know what there's an actual name for it. You could totally make this yourself. Don't go buy the commercial one because we've been doing this in therapy for years. If you have like a clock with like, it's analog, right? The one that's like, the thing that's going on. Okay. You could, if you have one of those, you can put tape markers on like, at the blue marker, we're going to do this. Like you can use those in different ways.
Yeah, cool.
So if you have something like that, that might come in handy also. So they have a sense. I know we draw on the ones that we have at work because they're designed for that. But even if you had like a $5 cheapo from Walmart, you could just draw on it with dry erase markers.
Perfect. Yeah, it was like this clock right here from like Target or whatever.
Yeah, totally. So something like that, you could be like the draw on or put tape on it to be like, this is when this is happening.
Yeah. Cool.
So there's an idea.
How long should rest time generally be to be restorative, or the downtime?
Right.
I know it'll vary.
This is a really good question. I think it's so different for everybody. I don't have a specific answer to that. I would say you're not like aiming for like an hour or anything, but it could be, I think this is another example of like, what is a little bit of like, I don't want to say, what is my child willing to do? That kind of is part of it. And then what is the outcome of that? If you're like, wow, having like 10 minutes after doing like schoolwork was really helpful and they were great, that might be your measurement. If you're like, wow, that did not make a difference and they've been crabby all day, it might be that they need a longer downtime. It might be that they need sensory input in addition to that downtime to recuperate.
Okay.
This is a little bit, the cycle that I was talking about, which was like input, skill, downtime, could be like input, skill, downtime, sensory input again.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's I think playing with different variables in terms of how you put those things together is probably going to be necessary just because everybody's so different.
Totally.
In terms of who they are as people, but then also like in terms of what their routine already looks like. How do you plug all these things in?
It made me think of a little girl who, in order to like engage in downtime, like if she was coming out of like skill and we were going to go into downtime, she benefited from like touch, and then she could enter into like, it would help her calm, and then she could do something to prolong that. So like I would sit next to her and read a book and massage her while I was reading or something along those lines.
Totally.
And calm her so that then I could step away and she could like color for a longer period of time or do something. You know what I mean?
Right. That's a great example of combining. You're like, they need the input and they need the downtime, but how do I maybe blend those two together a little bit?
Yeah. And then I could step away.
Right.
But if I
versus if you hadn't done the massage part, my guess is you probably couldn't have stepped away. Right.
No, and learn that from trial and error. So much of this, like, I think from the parent perspective, they're like, oh, teachers have it figured out. And so much of it, we spend like all of September figuring out, like with different kids, like what, and it's this reflective practice that we, is just a part of how we operate and a part of a teacher's life that I think we just don't do a great job of teaching parents. Everybody is at the end of the day saying, man, this circle time was a disaster. What was different about it? What might I tweak tomorrow? There's some trial and error here.
There totally is. And I think in my own work, I mean, my clients don't have hard days every time, but once in a while you're like, they lose it with me too. And I actually always make sure the parents know that, because it is like, they feel like you've got this figured out and they're perfect for you. And I'm like, well, I think we're all human and we're all, I can have a hard day, or I can make a mistake in terms of, oops, I asked them to do something that was way too hard and they totally lost it. Yeah. So I think their parents' experience might be that teachers always know what to do or therapists always know what to do. And the fact of the matter is like, that's actually not the case. Like we're always learning and thinking. And I think, and that's hard. And I have a full appreciation for the fact that my day with a client is, I might be with other people in a treatment space, but I am working one-on-one with the child. So when I have friends or families that I know that have 4 kids, you're like, that's pretty different. Like, you're home with 4 kids of different needs and abilities and like your own needs. It's pretty complicated. So I think being patient with yourself and figuring out what sort of chunks feel manageable. This isn't about getting this perfect. It's about just getting you thinking about things, and hopefully to make life feel easier and less stressful during this time. And I've been trying to focus on things that I feel like, hey, what are some of the benefits of what's going on now? My number one thing so far is I'm using technology more.
Yeah, look at you here.
But for families, right, these things that like the things that we're talking about aren't like, oh, when this is over, this doesn't matter. These are like life skills that we're talking about. So I do think there's value in what we're discussing.
Totally. And you brought up such a huge point that we should touch on, I think, of multiple kids. I know, like, I would even hear things sometimes from practitioners. I would be like, oh, do this. And I'm like, oh, cool. If I had 1 kid in my classroom, but I have 9 toddlers, like, that's not feasible. Right. And so I think as you're looking at these activities and trying to figure out, like, when do I fit things in? Maybe you have kids who have different input needs and different timing and all that jazz. As I was sharing earlier, like I realized like, oh, this kid might need this input like 15 minutes before the other kid. So that would structure when I would work in like connecting with them, right? Like if I know, all right, after we get diapers done and there's the rush of like coming in from outside and whatever, I know that there's usually like a 15-minute break before I'm getting lunch ready. And I'm going to like try and connect with one of these kiddos who might benefit from that. Right. I'm going to triage like who would benefit from that the most? Or maybe like what's an activity that we could do that brings everybody in, and maybe the kid who didn't super need this input also gets it. But the kid who really did gets it too.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a good point. I feel like, I remember going to a course years ago, this woman who was presenting was like, I used to tell families all these things when I was a young practitioner, right? Like do this and do that. And then you have your own family. And I actually, when I have PT, they're like, do these activities 3 times a day. You're like, what? How is that even going to happen? So I think it's hard to, there's a lot of things going on. So things with siblings is I think like what you're talking about is how do you like stagger schedules a little bit and triage needs. Mm-hmm. And the other one is maybe even thinking about like, oh, these 2 kids actually do like some of the same activities. Let's, if I have 4 kids and 2 of them like this, like kind of not pairing off, but like, let's both do the push game together, or let's both do the, they can do the steamroller to each other. So like, how can I like, get more done and get more bang for my buck in one thing versus like everybody needs a really specific thing on their own.
Yeah. Even when we would have like a classroom dance party, part of my thought process was like, who needs to be in my arms, like doing dips while we're dancing? Right. Do you know what I mean? Like who can I get some input in here?
That's a great example of how to get like the masses moving, and then everyone can get their needs met within that, right?
Yeah.
So for like, if you're talking about like if Emily and I were little kids, I'd be the one just kind of grooving, and you would have been flipping her upside down, right? Exactly. I'm sure she's going to love that I talked about her sensory threshold. We talk about this all the time. This is like, common discussion
Yeah. And I think we should talk about it more. I think we should know, like, I share that Zach and I have very different sensory profiles,
right.
and our needs are very different, and how we make that work and what that looks like.
Totally.
But okay, cool. So that actually, I had one more question here of like, what if your adult needs are like, my kid needs more touch than I can handle, it feels like.
Right. So like kids that are like wanting to cuddle all the time and do those kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I need space. For the love, I need a minute where no one's on my body. Right. I have for sure felt that.
Right. The thing that I coach parents to do in those situations is, and this is not easy, so everyone have grace with yourself that it's not, is your kid wants to climb all over you, you're like, I'm done. Mm-hmm. I don't want this. If you ask yourself, what do I think they're looking for? Right? And it could be sensory input. It could also be social connection. It doesn't have to just be sensory. Mm-hmm. Make a guess of what you think they want. I see your body wants a lot of touch. Do you think we should should we go do a game of steamroller so we can be together? You know, so giving another alternative. Or do you want mommy time right now? Mm-hmm. Why don't we sit? Your choices are we can read a book, or what? Like give them some alternatives that aren't them crawling all over you.
Yeah, totally.
Right?
Cool.
Right.
Yeah.
I think you have to listen to your own needs, because I think that's just a good practice. I think it's good for the parent to know how to handle that. I think it's good for kids to know, like, you know, there's two people in this relationship. Yeah. And this doesn't work. It works for you, but not for me. So how do we start to think about these things? I know with my nephew when we play, I'm like, what's the rule, Addison? He's like, we have to agree on what to do. Because, you know, certain games, I'm like, you're in your head and we're not playing together. I'm just watching you play, which is fine sometimes. But other times you're like, what would be fun for both of us?
Right.
So those are some of the things that I talk to families about. Yeah.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And sometimes I think, like, I'm just imagining this child that, again, like all these kids come up to my head of like, oh,
totally. Yeah, they're great examples.
Who wouldn't stop climbing or moving. Ever. Mm-hmm. Like she just like nonstop climbing and all the stuff, everything that she knew she shouldn't climb and all that jazz. And it would get so frustrating. And you actually came to my rescue and you were like, she's looking for input she's not getting. And in our mind, it was like, oh, she needs more things to climb on. But actually, when we started to give her more input where she could like go upside down, right, or when she was like bouncing on roadie, and we did that at intervals throughout the day, she wasn't climbing as much.
Right.
And it was like, oh, right, like that her body like didn't know how to get the input she was looking for.
Right. Alyssa, this is why I love talking to you, because that's such a good example. So the things that we're talking about, like kids that are like, they're seeking sensory input on their own, they're moving around a lot. This applies in classrooms. It definitely applies at the house too. Yeah. If they're doing it all the time, it means what they're doing, they're attempting to get whatever they need for their body, whether it's to self-regulate or understand their body better. If they're doing it all the time, it means it's not working.
Right.
So then you have to ask yourself, which is what we did with your student, which is, how do I give opportunities that aren't just like everyday sensory inputs, like walking and running? And how do I bump up the intensity of what they're getting? So inversion and those kind of things, she needed more intensity of input. And then you're not seeing that constant seeking of input. So that's definitely a good thing to think about. If your child is constantly seeking, it probably means you need to think of increasing the intensity of what the actual input is that you're doing.
Yeah. So
I always give the example of walking for adults, like walking versus running, not really the same experience.
Yeah.
And for a lot of clients that actually they do have underlying sensory processing challenges, that threshold is higher than most of ours.
Right.
I have clients that spin for a long time and the parents are like, they're not going to throw up. I'm like, nope, I actually would not be unhappy if they did throw up, because it means it's actually getting into their system.
Yeah. We like hit their threshold. Yeah. It's like a rubber band, right? Like stretching without breaking it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, it made me think of the snoo. We talk about the snoo as like a bed, and it has like a built-in swaddle, and it's only for newborns, and it goes back and forth. Mm-hmm. And then it'll slow down when kids are asleep. And then it has a sensor. It's by Dr. Harvey Karp, and it has a sensor in it that when if a kid kicks his feet or something, it'll speed back up to like see like, oh, if we give you this input, does it help you calm down?
Wow.
It's dreamy, but we shared about it recently on Instagram, and people were like, oh my gosh, like, isn't that bad for their head to be moving? And I was like, when you have the child who needs this input in order to sleep right now, who came out the womb with this, you are like, oh my gosh, the snoo. It's like life changing, because that's the kid that we're like, yeah, I know, mom, like you're living on a yoga ball right now, and they need that input. But for other babies, like that intensity of back and forth might be too much.
Right. Yeah. I think that's amazing that those things exist, because that child probably wouldn't be sleeping, and therefore parents wouldn't be sleeping. And that, in terms of just general health implications, oh boy.
Totally. And
so cool that those things exist. I never heard of that.
And that it's actually regulating for them. Right. And for other humans, they might not need that to regulate.
Right.
It's different for everybody. All right. Is there anything else you want to leave people with?
I had a couple, I wanted to just kind of comment on the engaging the brains, and I had a couple like general, like, I don't want to say tips, but thoughts as we're kind of wrapping up of like what to do with this information. Does that sound okay?
Absolutely.
Are we okay on time?
I can hang out with you all day.
I know. We'll just, we'll hang up for the recording and just like chat the day away.
For sure.
So engaging the brain activities, I don't think we need to talk about so much in terms of like what to do, because those are existing naturally, right? We're playing board games and having social demands and those things. But I did want to share a couple of like ideas, one, in case you need them, and two, to understand that they're different than sensory activities. And I actually did a little bit of, I'm going to call it informal research on what I've been seeing on social media to be like, this is why this is different. So I've been seeing fort building, which is a great way to engage your brain, but the actual building part for most people is not the sensory rich part at all, right? You're like, I'm thinking and collecting materials and putting them up. That's definitely like engaging the brain. The other one that I actually really like a lot is people taking like streamers and making like a laser beam thing, and you have to like go between them.
Cool. Yeah.
I was like, I like that game. I want to play
like that. The movie Entrapment with Catherine Zeta-Jones. Totally.
But like, that's not a sensory rich activity. It's a physical activity that you're like, having to do planning and those kind of things. So I wanted to just think those are different. They're more that's more engaging the brain than it is sensory rich.
Oh, I have a clarifying question then. So organizational skills, all related to your sensory systems, that would be cognitive though.
That's where there's like this interesting touch point of where, so part of sensory integration is called praxis, which is like, I have an idea and I can figure out how to make my body do it. And that does have a connection point between sort of executive functioning and cognition. So different things can influence. So if you were thinking, I want to set up a fort, there's a cognitive part of that. There's also a praxis. I have an idea. What materials do I need? So that's where those two things blend. I've heard people that are experts on executive functioning speak, and they're like, it is hard to know where the boundary is. So I think you can kind of blend those concepts together.
But that's not going to be, even though we're still like, there is the praxis part, it's not considered sensory rich. We're still going to like categorize that under like cognitive.
Right. Yeah. Okay. But what you like, if you wanted to make one of those sensory rich, like you're like, oh, we're going to put all the supplies for the parents, put all the supplies in the laundry basket. The kid pushes the stuff over to build the fort. So you could actually figure out how to blend things together like that. But the actual like planning and building part is not something that I would describe as organizing for most people. It's not nobody.
Right. Okay.
All right. So I wanted to think about like being so patient with my notes. I love my like low tech setup. So now that we know what all these things are, it doesn't take away the fact that you're being like bombarded with information on social media, right? Totally. So my thought on this is, I think parents who are listening may be thinking about like, what are a couple of activities in each category that might work? So this is not about having a new activity every day, not about using the same activity every day, but having a couple things in each category that you can kind of go to so that you're not working so hard to figure out what they are.
Yeah.
Probably based on sensory preferences, what you have available for space, what your kid likes. You could definitely pick activities of what we just talked about or things that you've seen on social media. You might also be like, hey, my kid loves that inversion game already. Like that's in, you might just pick, or Upside Down Baby. I love that name.
Yeah.
So you might just pick that. So this is not about having a novel activity every single day. It's really about like having a couple of go-tos in each categories.
Cool.
Other things to think about, I think we already talked about it a little bit, is like, are there activities we can do together, either child and parent or multiple siblings? You might think about what level of independence you might want. This is a time that, it's hard to know from child to child and given the circumstances exactly what that's going to look like. But, if you're like, I need to go make lunch, you might try to coordinate that with their downtime. Right. Those kind of things.
Okay.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm just going through my notes. What did I want to talk about? We already talked about how do we know if this is working. I think you know yourself and or your child, and you think, okay, you were just saying, I got to the end of the day and it was a good day. Okay, so what did we do that made that happen? It wasn't we know as therapists and teachers, that's never a fluke, right? You're like,
it doesn't
we did something collectively that worked for that child or that family. So I have to figure out what was that thing.
Yeah, actually, this came up this morning in that parent support group where mom was like, we had the best day we've had, and I was like, great, what do you think was really helpful? And like, because I want her to think about like what was helpful in regulating, totally, so that we can continue to bring those things each day or whenever we can.
Yeah, and I think that's reinforcing for a parent to be like, you figured out what works for your child. I mean, that feels like incredibly empowering to me.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. I think those are all are there other things that you're thinking about? Those are all the kind of things that I was thinking about.
I think that sounds really great. And I think we covered a lot for folks. Yeah, if people wanted to dive deeper into like learning about sensory systems, if they're like me and would have tuned into this and been like, oh my gosh, I want to get nerdy now. I know for us, I've interviewed you for our podcast. It's episode 4, Voices of Your Village podcast. We have that. And anytime I'm doing anything in life, I'm just like, Lori, I need you. And Lori's coming to Mama's Getaway, which was just rescheduled to September. She's a part of the SEED certification coming out to support teachers, doing a workshop for them. So you, I feel like, are ingrained into SEED, and people will be able to find you within SEED. If they wanted to dive into more sensory specific stuff, where can they find stuff, like through OTA or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think the podcast that I did with you, which was, I think that was 2 years ago at this point, which feels like implausible. I know, it feels like we just did it. It was my first podcast. I think that's an interesting, it's a good overview of what sensory integration is. Mm-hmm. If you're just curious about sensory integration and like how it matters in different ways, I definitely did like a little tiny mini intro here. So there's more information on there. Mm-hmm. The organizations that I'm affiliated with are OTA, the Kumar Center, and the Spiral Foundation, which are both located in Newton, Massachusetts. And you can certainly go on their website. Spiral has some interesting things. We are working to get some more resources up for families. I would say in the meantime, if you follow either group on social media, on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook, we are new to the social media platform. I know therapists have been working really hard to post activity ideas. Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping that today gives a framework if you're like, I looked at that activity. Yep, that definitely is one we can use, or nope. So that when you're filtering out those kind of things. I think I had given you a book list of probably when I did the podcast with you, Alyssa, if people are super interested. Yeah. I think it's really important to be thinking about the concepts we're talking about today are not for people that have identified sensory processing challenges. They certainly could be. Right. But I think the purpose of me talking is really to think, how do we take sensory integration theory and knowledge and say, how do we use this for the masses during a time that we need to be taking care of ourselves and thinking of our sort of physical and emotional well-being? So that was kind of the purpose of today. Some of the other talks and different resources that you're going to find are going to be a little bit less focused on that and a little bit more focused on, does your child have a sensory processing challenge and those things? So that might not so anyway, it's sort of like if you're interested in the topic, but I think you're going to find different frameworks. But if you see activities that are for people with sensory processing challenges, you can still use those activities. They're not like, oh, well, that's only for those people. It's for anybody.
Yeah, I love that. Actually, that's like the goal of me bringing you into like Mama's Getaway or the SEED certification, especially, that I, as a teacher in a classroom of 9 kids, didn't have 9 kids who were qualified for OT services, and every single child and adult in that room benefited from having more information and knowledge from you about sensory systems, that
Right.
this is stuff that every single human is doing all day long, right?
Yeah.
And we can optimize our systems or not. And my hope is to be able to give more and more folks access to this general knowledge that I think a lot of people don't get access to unless your kid is diagnosed.
Right.
And I think that that's like a systems failure on our end that we're going to try to slowly chip away at it, Seed.
Right. Yeah. I mean, my hope, I think what you're doing is amazing to get information out to so many more people. I mean, the more teachers I talk to, they're like, why don't we learn about this in school? I'm like, we can't possibly all know, like, I can't know everything that teachers know. You can't know everything that I know, but like, how do you get small amounts of cross-pollination?
Mm-hmm.
I know I've spent a large percentage of my career being like, I'm learning about dietary work and I'm learning about this because my responsibility is to my clients to be like, I want to think of them comprehensively, not just what my slice of the pie is. But it takes time as a professional to build that up. And I don't think them doing it in college or in grad school would necessarily like eliminate that, but it might like plant some seeds.
Right.
Yeah, no pun intended. It might plant some seeds that might be interesting. So it is. I feel like what you're doing is really amazing. And I hope this information has been helpful. And I hope everyone take care of themselves, take care of your children. And hopefully we're back with some more information soon.
Yeah, totally. And give yourself grace, man. There's so much trial and error.
Totally. Yeah, totally.
Thanks, Lori.
Thanks, Alyssa.